What's up, everybody? Welcome. This is Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health. Hope everybody's having a terrific Thursday. We like to pop on here live right around noon-ish Eastern time on Thursdays, and we talk all things Syracuse sports. We talk basketball. We've got the lacrosse page on today because we got lacrosse starting to really hit its groove here. So some issues to get into there, but certainly basketball on the minds of many, with Syracuse finishing the regular season. Believe it or not, the regular season concludes on Saturday at the JMA Wireless Dome as Wake Forest comes to town. It's senior day. It's a 2003 celebration day. And could it be the last game Jim Boeheim coaches at the Dome? A question that at least has to be tossed into the ether for consideration and discussion. So all that on the table. But what I love about doing this here program is anything's on the table. Anything you guys want to ask about. There's some football news out there. We didn't turn the football page on today, but there's certainly some football news out there this week. Garrett Schrader is going to miss spring practice. And what does that mean for the football team? All things are open here today. We are ahead of the Syracuse women's basketball matchup against NC State. We do this live on Thursdays for those of you that are watching down the road here on YouTube. And they're right on the bubble. They are literally, according to Charlie Cream, who is the ESPN bracketologist for women's basketball, the last team in when it comes to the NCAA tournament. So certainly the men's team is not going to make the NCAA tournament, barring a miracle run upcoming here in the ACC tournament, which, I mean, you got to play a little defense to do that. So I think that's going to be an extraordinarily difficult task for the Orange. But there could be a Syracuse basketball team in March Madness. Felicia Leggett-Jack, and company could be there. So we're doing the show ahead of their matchup against NC State in the ACC tournament. We'll see how that plays out. And one way or the other, it's going to be a lot of fingers crossed when it comes to Selection Sunday for the ladies. George, hello. Welcome in. How are you? There's Doug saying, let's go Orange women. There you go. And Bay says, is Syracuse even making the, I believe you mean the CBI, right? And the answer to that is I highly doubt it, that they would qualify for it. But I think you actually have to pay to play in the CBI, not to mention that's kind of an ego blow. So I just don't see Syracuse playing in the CBI at this point. Chuck starts us off saying, would someone from within really change the program if Boeheim were to retire? So let's address that question, right? Let's say Boeheim does decide to retire. Do you just put Jerry McNamara or Red Autry in place, or do you broaden the scope and do a national search? The other day, John Wildhack was doing some local radio interviews, and he said, like in any sport, you have a list of coaches that you kind of keep track of here. I do think Wildhack would do his due diligence there, would look around, and we could throw a million names out there. I don't really want to get into that at this point until we literally cross that bridge, but I would encourage Wildhack to do that. I think Jerry would be a great coach. I think Red would be a great coach. Being the guy after the guy is going to be as tough a task as it can get here. Think of having to be the guy after Dean Smith at North Carolina. John Shire's doing it at Duke now, seems to be off to a pretty good start. They didn't even lose a game at home this year, and Duke is still very much in the mix when it comes to the top recruits in the country. The jury's still out in a lot of ways there. So sometimes being the guy after the guy is easier. If you promote from within, that doesn't work, then you broaden the scope a little bit, right? But I do think if and when they get there, John Wildhack should do that. Ken Severud should do that, right? But I think the most likely thing that's going to happen is that they promote from within, and I do think it's going to be Jerry McNamara, and that's something that's happening Saturday, right? Jerry, Hakeem, the 2003 championship team gets celebrated on Saturday. They're all going to be back, and the juxtaposition of celebrating the high point of the Jim Boeheim era, the Syracuse basketball era, and frankly, its low point right now in the Boeheim era. There's been some lower points in the history of Syracuse basketball, but I think you can argue this is the low point. They're coming off a losing season a year ago, something that never happened under Boeheim until then, and depending on what happens with this team, if they lose to Wake Forest and let's say lose in the ACC tournament, and remember, there is a scenario they could slide back to day one. They could be playing on Tuesday. If Georgia Tech loses to Boston College and Syracuse loses to Wake Forest, the Orange slide back to Tuesday, and they would play day one. Tuesday in Greensboro, scenario you try to avoid. They've been there once. They did win that game, but then lose the next. Syracuse has not gone deep in the ACC tournament since they've been in the ACC, winning a game here or there, but haven't made a substantial run in that tournament since getting in to the ACC. So that would be difficult to certainly win 4 in a row. 5 in a row is impossible. It's flat out impossible the way this team is playing right now. So keep that in mind. That's a scenario in play too. But that 2003 team, I mean, the fact that it has been 20 years since that team won a national championship is incredible. It's incredible to think about, where we've come since then, where the program is. Just what was your life like, 20 years ago, and finally seeing this team win a national championship. They came so close, depending on how far back you go. Like Syracuse played in that 1975 Final Four with Jimmy Lee and company. That was a great team. You had 1987, of course. I shall not say his name, who hit that shot for Indiana. 1996, and that magical Cuse in the house run with John Wallace and Z and Jason Sapola and company. And then, when it finally culminates and happens in 2003, and just, that season, like, I don't think it really hit me that team could win the national championship until pretty deep in the tournament. And remember, one of the gems of that tournament was they got to play in Boston, then they got to play in Albany. They had home court advantage, right, as the 3 seed. And here we are 20 years later, home court advantage, regional advantage, still very much something you can use to your advantage in college basketball. But the crowds were insane. At the time I was only doing radio. I was not working for syracuse.com yet. And, doing radio shows at sports bars that surrounded the arena in Boston and Albany, and how crazy the fans were and just how happy they were that they clinched the Final Four. And then, look, Carmelo Anthony from day one. I mean, Syracuse plays Memphis to start that season at Madison Square Garden. And you just knew, like, this kid's different. Like, you had certainly heard about the recruitment, and he was the best recruit since Billy Owens. And, it's not like Carmelo Anthony came in as like a trade secret, right? But man, just to see him in that, I think he scored like 29 points in that game. And you knew you had something special, but it never occurred to me that they'd win the title. It was never a thought until they got pretty deep in that NCAA tournament. And I started to say, okay, this has come together. You got a special talent here. Jerry McNamara had emerged at that point. You had great role players. Queth Dwaney, they called him Grandpa, right, because of his leadership, and one of the older players on the team, Jeremy McNeil, Craig Forth, Billy Edelin, Josh Pace. I mean, everybody had a role, right? Hakeem Warwick, who's going to get celebrated with Jerry McNamara on Saturday, known for the block, of course, one of the greatest plays in the history of the tournament, let alone Syracuse basketball. And everybody had to play a role. They were down by 17 points to Oklahoma State. What was that, in the second round of that tournament? And Jeremy McNeil was huge in that role. Craig Forth had to have big games in the zone for Syracuse. People had to step up. Carmelo Anthony was playing with a bad back for most of that tournament and Final Four, for that matter, and still had an incredible tournament and incredible championship game. Hakeem Warwick and the dunk against Texas. I mean, all the memories that come flooding back here. So it's going to be great to celebrate that. It should be celebrated, and significant marks in time. 20 years is an incredible time to look back on. It does coincide, though, with where this team's at now and trying to find itself here and finish the season strong, and, just the questions that surround it. So who's coming back from this team? Because all the seniors that will be celebrated on Senior Day, all have eligibility. Joe Girard, Jesse Edwards, John Bolajak. I know he's been kind of absent on the court as of late, but he'll be celebrated on Senior Day. Symir Torrance as well. They all have eligibility. It doesn't mean they're all going to come back. They could go their separate ways for life. They could go their separate ways in the case of Joe and Jesse to pursue professional careers somewhere. Like, that's going to be an interesting conversation. And it's going to be an interesting conversation based on what Jim Boeheim decides to do, what these players decide to do. If Judah Mintz is going to pursue a pro career, I think at the very least he should test the waters and see what they're saying there. I think he'd be a first-round pick next year if he came back, but, to each his own at this point. So that's the irony of senior day, is you don't know whose last game it's going to be. Even the seniors, right? Even the seniors could be back next season. Do I think all 4 of them will be back? I don't think that's likely, just by, the natural course of things, but it is certainly something to think about out there. And, I said this on the post-game show. I wrote a column about this on syracuse.com as well. Coming out of that Georgia Tech game, that was the first time I truly felt like, okay, we've discussed it 100 times. The key is I had the feeling right here that this could be it for Boeheim. Right? Like, legitimately could be it. I don't know that to be true. Jim does some radio shows on Thursday. He does his own radio show Thursday night. Maybe he'll shed some light on that in these conversations. He's had a couple of days to kind of, shrug off the Georgia Tech loss, as bad as that was. 4 straight games, 17 points or more, 3 straight teams that have scored 90 points or more. But it just feels like we're getting closer and closer to that being reality. All these years, all these topics, all the discussions about it, it's starting to feel a little bit more real, because, this would be 2 years in a row that they don't make the tournament and will either be a losing team or maybe around 500 and just not living up to the performance that is expected there. And Chuck makes a great point with his comment here. I said it Tuesday night, and it's worth reiterating. That press conference that Jim had took on a much different tone. To his credit, by the way, I got to give Jim a lot of credit. Calm, accommodating, apologetic, answered the questions, and just the way he explained things, took blame, put it on himself. It's my defense. I've got to fix it. It's on me. It wasn't typical Jim Boeheim, right? When Jim is still in the fight, right? Think back a month ago when he's challenging student reporters and talking to Pete Thamel from ESPN afterwards. And it was kind of weird that Jim said he thought he was off the record in that conversation. That's, we've discussed that. We'll just kind of slide past that at this point. But he was defiant. He was competitive. He was, no, I can still do this, right? I'm not saying Jim's given up, but he was a lot more humble and resigned to where this team's at after that Georgia Tech loss. Now, can they rally here against Wake Forest? It's almost not important whether they win or lose. It's how they play the game. Not to break out an old cliche, but man, Georgia Tech, it was a lifeless effort. I'm not saying they quit. I don't think they quit, but they had their hearts ripped out. And your head gets in the way. You're doubting yourself. Defense's desire. I don't care if it's 2-3, 1-3-1, man-to-man. The Chicago Bears 46 defense, right? Name me a defense. It's desire. And Syracuse just didn't have it in that Georgia Tech game. So they had yesterday off. They play Tuesday night. They lose badly. They had yesterday off, mandated day off. So you got today and Friday to get in the lab, and really it's gut check time. How do you come out on Saturday with that 2003 team back, with what should actually be, I would imagine, a decent crowd? I think there's a lot of people that are like, man, if this is Boeheim's last game, I think I want to be there for that. It's not going to be like, 35,000, something like that, but a crowd that's going to be intrigued by what they see. The celebration of the past, wondering what the future is going to be. And then they play a basketball game, and let's see how they play against another talented offensive team. Wake Forest is a bubble team. Wake Forest is, look, if Georgia Tech can drop 18 3-pointers on you, and I just can't comprehend that as bad of an offensive team as Georgia Tech is, that they scored 18 3-pointers on you. But what Syracuse fell into defensively in that game, I heard Chris Joseph talk about this, and he's dead on when he says they were hoping they'd miss instead of making them miss. You got to make them miss. You got to get in their face. You got to hustle. And I know there's a lot of gaps in the zone and catching up in the zone. And look, we saw this after the Pitt game. What you saw against Pitt was a lot of players just out of position, running back, trying to defend shots. It's that old move where they're kind of going from one place to the other in the zone and their arms are up like this, that kind of last ditch effort. Like, let me just put my arms up and, see if that qualifies as defense. It was worse against Georgia Tech. So look, I think some people speculate about, is there something going on with the team? Like Chris Bell, Jim Boeheim mentioned at the press conference, was supposed to start the other night against Georgia Tech, but, basically wasn't hustling on 5 or 6 straight plays at practice. How you practice is important to Jim Boeheim. I hate to speculate on that, but I've seen this before. When teams play this badly, there's usually an explanation for it. There's something else going on that is affecting how they play. Now, that being said, they're fine on offense. This is only happening on defense where they have just completely fallen apart and they have been completely ineffective. They shot 48% in that game the other night. I don't want to say the offense is good, but it's fine. It's good enough to win if you play some sort of defense. And that's what they were doing earlier this year. Think of the Miami game, the North Carolina game, Virginia, the first Pitt game. You can go through a number of close games that didn't go Syracuse's way, but they were competitive. And that's been the most disheartening thing about the last 4 games is, man, look, 17 or more points they've lost by, 18 3-pointers for Georgia Tech, but everybody's hitting threes on this team. Duke was bombing threes. Clemson was bombing threes. Pitt had 16 3-pointers. So, Catherine brings up a good question here. Is team morale in the basement? It's hard to say no to that question. I don't think morale is at its best, but what you do to rally, Jerry McNamara was talking about this the other day. Of course, will be honored on Saturday with his long overdue jersey retirement. At the end of his senior year, remember, Syracuse lost to DePaul. I believe the score of that game was 108-69, if memory serves. Geez, I can't remember to bring the garbage out half the time, but I remember the score of that game. Just the stupid stuff that sticks in your head, right? So there was that game. And remember, Jerry's senior day, Villanova, the first of many dome games that set attendance records. All the people that came up, they did this for a number of games, but busloads of people from Scranton come to Jerry's last game, and Villanova trucked them. But then the Big East tournament run happened, the overrated run, the 10 bleeping games run, right? Syracuse lost to Texas A&M in the tournament because they were just so exhausted, and Jerry was hurt by then. He actually had some, I think it was a hip injury at that point. You could just tell how exhausted he was and mentally and physically drained he was in that tournament. But they made the tournament. This team's not going to make the tournament, right? Their only ticket in is to win. Right now it's 4. It might have to be 5 in the ACC tournament, which there's no way they can do that with the way this team's playing right now. I mean, never doubt Syracuse, I guess. But I think the likelihood of that is very, very, very low at this point. So morale is a big question right now. As Larry says, standing around looking at one another isn't coaching. Larry, I think coaching comes up, and look, when you're a central figure like Jim Boeheim, you're the center of the universe, good, bad, and ugly. But I put a lot of this on the players too. The players know what they're tasked with doing. The players know where they have to be in the zone, and that it's hustle, it's desire, it's movement, it's keeping your hands up, it's keeping your feet moving, and they're not doing their job either, right? And does that go back to coaching and motivation? Man, if you need a coach to motivate you, not to look, how can I put this? Not to embarrass yourself, as Syracuse did in these last 4 games, then we're completely lost here, right? I think there's a lot of things that go into coaching, right? You're a psychologist, you're a motivator, you're an X's and O's tactician, you're a life coach in addition to basketball. But you got to put some of this on the players too, because while they didn't quit, I'm not going to say that. I'm very careful in using that word. They certainly weren't playing as hard as they could. They had their hearts ripped out. The weight of everything that's been happening on the court and whatever's happening off the court kind of fell on them at Georgia Tech, and they were shamed. They were embarrassed, right? Hopefully you turn that around and use that fuel just to play better against against Wake Forest, just to put out a better effort, make it a game, right? Go out with some kind of effort. And I'll give you an example, guys. Last year, as disheartening as last year was, and you kind of knew they were flirting with a losing season, and everybody was like trying to take that in because we had never seen it before in the history of Syracuse basketball. They go to the ACC tournament. They play a great game against Florida State, and they obviously had to win that tournament to have any hope of getting any postseason, let alone the NCAA or NIT, which they played in neither last year. The Buddy Boeheim punch thing happens. They play a great game against Duke. They lost that game, but at the very least, you walked away from the season like, okay, they gave me everything they had. Jimmy Boeheim scores 28 points, tried to rally the team. It wasn't good. Nobody was, how can I put this? Nobody was like gaslighting here, like, oh, an amazing season. But at least they went out with a strong effort, right? You're only as good as your last game. So I think that's the theme this team has to take into these last, at the very least, 2 games, Saturday and whenever they play in the ACC tournament. You're only as good as your last game. Leave a last impression. What's that last impression going to be? A team that lost 6 in a row, if that ends up what it being, and looking completely lost and dispirited and setting records for futility on defense? Or did you rally and fight and get to the finish line as best as you can? That's what's really on the line for this team. Chris says, any chance Bell gets another shot this year so he stays for next year? Chris, I think so, but it depends on what he does in practice the next 2 days. Because if Jim Boeheim's not starting you because of what you did in practice earlier this week, as he noted at his press conference, if Chris was dejected in the locker room after the Georgia Tech game, they all were, but there was a particular kind of mood and silence that he had in that game. He's got to show it in practice. He's got to show that will. We talked about it throughout the year with Chris, with rebounding, right? That's another thing. Half the battle with rebounding is desire. It's want to. It's getting after it. Look at how Judah Mintz leads by example there. Look how, Malik Brown plays his butt off every game. Malik is a limited player offensively. His game, I think, has a lot of room to grow, but he plays his butt off when he's out there. Even Benny Williams, for all the up and down of Benny Williams, when he's on and he's flowing, that's a guy that brings a little lift and a little energy. He didn't have quite the game against Georgia Tech that he did against Pitt. So that's on Chris Bell. I would put Chris Bell high on the list of possibilities to transfer just by, what we've seen this year. And just sometimes players get in a system, they're in it day to day, they see what everything's like, and they say, this is not for me, right? Is Benny Williams going to think about transferring? We mentioned the guys that have eligibility to come back or not. Like, this is the reality of college basketball today. Soon as that season ends, and the speculation's already begun, but as soon as that season ends, it's like, okay, who's in, who's out? You move fast. You go in the portal. Jim Boeheim's mentioned there's already been players that have expressed interest in transferring to Syracuse, and the process moves so quickly. And then there's the decision, the process, the discussion about whether Jim returns for another season. Like, there's just a lot that's going to happen when the season ends, and that at this point appears to be sooner rather than later, right? You got one more regular season game. I don't see them making too far of a run in the ACC tournament. Then after that, they're not going to be in the NCAA tournament. I doubt highly they will be in the NIT. They're not projected to even get picked for that. And then, like last year, that's 2 years in a row with no significant postseason on your resume other than the ACC tournament. And the micro conversations about the here and now, and then the macro conversations about just the broad scope of Syracuse basketball, who's coaching the team and where we're at here, they kind of come together, right? It's a fascinating day on Saturday. I keep using that word, but it's the one that keeps coming to mind. The juxtaposition of high point of the Boeheim tenure versus the low point of the tenure, the past, the past, the present, and the future, all compacted into one here, and a lot of questions that will be answered in due time. Not all answered immediately, but you got to answer pretty quickly to turn the page to next year, to be aggressive, to build something, to get Syracuse back to where it needs to be, no matter who's coaching the team, no matter what the scenario is at this point. Mikey says, is this team capable of having a team meeting to address their lack of hustle and get some goals for final games? Who's the leader of that meeting? I actually, not to tease ahead here, Mikey, if you're watching live here, I'm going to air an interview later this afternoon with Joe Girard on my radio show. And I asked him that very question. And I think he was pretty diplomatic about it, but I would put it on Joe. I think, look, you don't have to be a senior to be a leader, but it carries more weight. If you're Gerard and you're Jesse and you're Simir and even John Bull, who's got a couple years of eligibility remaining, but it's on those veterans to look those young guys in the eye and say, look, you need to do this for us. We need to go out with our best effort, okay? We have put in the time, the sweat, the blood, the tears, and we've had success. We've been to the tournament. We know what it's like. You got to go out with your best effort. So if you want to do it for them, if there's a sense you got to do it for Boeheim, if they're getting a feeling this could be it for him, do it for Jerry because he's being honored on Saturday. Do it for the fans. I don't care who you do it for, but I would put that on Joe and the seniors to kind of send that message to the younger guys. Like, we can't go out like this. We've got to go out as strong as we can. And that doesn't necessarily mean wins and losses. It just means how they're playing. That's a great question you had there. Joe says, if the 03 team at their age played this team, the old guys would run them out of the dome. I mean, Melo certainly got some game at this point. Bill checking in from Nashville saying, unfortunately, they've shown the energy and fight of an old man. Haven't followed them that much for the first time in 48 years. Just sad where the program is at this point. Julie checks in to say they need to play like they did against NC State. Julie, the key thing about the NC State game was balanced effort. That's one of the few games this year that you had 5 guys in double figures, right? This team has relied too much on Judah, Joe, Jesse, some combination there, and then a couple of other guys contribute. And that's just been missing, particularly from the forward position. It's been Benny Williams in spots. It's been Chris Bell in spots. Justin Taylor is just overwhelmed right now. I like Justin Taylor. I think he's going to be a good player, but I just think he's been thrust into a role he's not ready for yet. The forward position has been an enigma. We talked about Malik Brown and his strengths and weaknesses. So they're not getting, Jim Boeheim actually talked about this at his presser the other night. They're not getting just that extra guy that they need to complement the big three. So, Julie, that's a great point. If they can get a balanced, particularly offensive effort, and they're going to need all the offense they can get because this defense has just been so terrible as of late. They need that kind of effort. And think about the irony of that. They get their best win of the year. They beat NC State on Valentine's Day and have just gotten run out of the gym in every game since then. Paul says zone used to stymie opposition in years past, especially with 2 rangy guards at the top by forcing them to use much of the shot clock. The difference the last 4 games is ACC teams have figured out the best way to beat the zone is by treating the ball as a hot potato. That's exactly right, Paul. Jim Boeheim downplays this, but look at the assist rate that teams have had against Syracuse. They've had 15 or more assists. God, it's at least 15, 16 times this year against Syracuse. 27 of 32 field goals assisted in the Georgia Tech game. Pitt had a similar rate to that. Like, what Jim is saying is, so think about the zone. You come down the court, 1 or 2 passes, someone hits a 3, that's an assist. So I understand the logic there, but look at the rate of assists that teams have against you. And then look at how many assists you're tossing out and the lack of ball movement that's there. Paul, the other thing is the mental game the zone used to play. That's gone. It's just absolutely gone. Not only using the shot clock, it made you think, right? Where am I supposed to be? What's going on? Who's this? You start seeing ghosts out there. That is completely gone. And it's just every team you play can shoot the 3 now. I don't care what their percentage is, especially the last few games. Syracuse has given up 18 3-pointers, 16 3-pointers, 13 3-pointers. Like, they hand you 10 3-pointers just by walking in the door at this point. So you've lost the mental edge there. So that has to be made up for to steal a line from Bill Raftery. You got to play zone with man-to-man principles. And those man-to-man principles are, you got to hustle your ass off. And that's just what it is, right? So we'll see if they can fix that on Saturday. As Joe notes here, Axe, we need boots on the ground to find out what's really going on with his team. Yeah, Joe, sometimes, eventually it all comes out. If there's something going down there, practice used to be open. It no longer is open. You hear things, but, some of that's harder to validate than others. I'm sure it all will come out eventually. I just think a lot of it right now is just frustration. And that's what was telling about Boeheim's presser the other night, was how open he was about things, how calm he was about things, and he didn't have the answer for some of it. If Jim has the answer, he'll tell you. He'll call people out. He didn't have the answer. He's like, I don't know what's going on with this defense, and I believed him. And for him to openly talk about playing for pride in the month of March, he's right to say so. That's all they have left to play for at this point. So that was the honest answer and the true answer. It's still startling to hear Jim Boeheim say that. But, that's kind of where we're at this point. I did want to give a little shout out to lacrosse here, because lacrosse season's well underway. A couple of things. The Syracuse women's lacrosse team, I mean, what more can you ask them to do? 5-0. They just trucked Albany yesterday at the Dome, 22-5. They are cruising right now. They've got some tougher games upcoming on their schedule, some ranked teams upcoming on their schedule, but all the makings of a national championship contender. And until I see otherwise, that's what I'm going to call it. That's what I'm going to label it. They'll lose a couple of games just because it's a tough sport with some good teams on their schedule, but this team is really, really good. The soccer team won a national championship, and now you could have another title contender in Syracuse women's lacrosse. So shout out to them. Like we said, we're broadcasting live. If you're watching live, if you're watching later on YouTube, we're ahead of the Syracuse women's basketball game. So as we speak, I don't know the results of Syracuse NC State. I'm going to be fascinated to see if they have to win this game to get into the NCAA tournament, because should they beat NC State, Notre Dame awaits the number 1 seed, right? So will one ACC tournament win be enough? If they lose to NC State, can they still find their way in? That might be tough, but they are right on the line. And unlike the men's basketball team, the fact that the women's team is on the bubble is an incredible turnaround. They went 11-18 a year ago. They went 18-11 this year under Coach Jack. 5 more ACC wins. And the fact that they're even in the conversation for the tournament is just remarkable. Deja Ferris got a big decision to make. Speaking of players coming back or not, she could be certainly a top pick in the WNBA draft. Despite her size, should she choose to go into the draft, if she comes back, now you got yourself a team. We'll see if Georgia Woolley's available for that game too. She's been in concussion protocol lately. So one way or the other, it's going to be a very nervous selection Sunday for one basketball team anyway. Other lacrosse note I wanted to get out there was the men's lacrosse team. So last week they fell to North Carolina. They're still coming along. They were outshot 22-7 in the second quarter of that game. Carolina just thumped them in that quarter. Syracuse played a much better second half. Their face-off guy at Axe, Johnny Rachuza, I think is getting better. There's a better option there than they've had, than I thought they would have. Losing Danny Varela, losing a couple of guys at the face-off X in recent years that were dominant. Jacob Fopp, of course, as well. That defense is still young and learning. I think Will Mark missed a bunch of saves in that Carolina game that he normally makes. Offense is still very talented, just kind of finding their way. They get they get Duke on Sunday at the Dome. That's a top 5 team. Duke jumped a bunch of spots in the rankings this week. They knocked off Penn last week. Duke is very talented, good offensive team, solid all around. Now a top 5-6 team. So another stiff challenge for Gary Gate and company here as we kind of measure their improvement. I don't think that's a tournament team quite yet. I think everybody kind of knew this was a rebuild year. This was a restock year, but there's a lot more talent on that field. There's a lot more encouragement on that field. I see the process building. It's just they're not quite on the level of some of the teams that are in their league and are on their schedule, but maybe they'll surprise us and take one Sunday. It's actually a doubleheader at the Dome on Sunday. The women's team plays at 11. The men's team plays at 4. If you want to check out a full day of lacrosse at the Dome on Sunday following the basketball game, of course, against Duke against Wake Forest. Shout out to Pete Sala and his Dome crew who've got to flip the Dome rather quickly. 5 o'clock basketball game will end about 7, and they'll have the Dome ready the next morning for lacrosse. So that hardworking crew at the Dome going to flip that in a short period of time. That's always an incredible process to see play out. What's up, Brian? My man, he's in town. Oh, sorry, Linda. You're not Brian. Linda says, what other teams learned about Syracuse last week was don't put SU's mans up players on the field. Yes, the man up. 5 out of 10 on the man up last week, Linda, for Syracuse, which needs to be better with the offensive talent that they have. Now we go to my man, Brian. Happy anniversary. Happy birthday to Z89. 50 years on the air radio, right? And hoping for a women's win today. They definitely deserve our attention. And all true, Brian. Have fun in town. Have fun at the banquet. Shout out to all the Z89 people back in town this weekend for the annual banquet. Big one, 50 years celebration of Z89. And 89 won the Pulse back in the day. Shout out to that. So, yeah, there's quite a few people coming back into town to see a 2003 celebration, to see one last game for the seniors, maybe, and ultimately, maybe, perhaps, could be Jim Boeheim's last home game as head coach. I don't know. I wouldn't bet on it, but I think we're just kind of at the point you got to at least throw it out there for consideration. And I think that's what a lot of people are wondering walking into that dome on Saturday. Was this going to be it for Boeheim too? We shall see. Thanks for hanging, guys. Always appreciate you coming by here on Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health. So Saturday night, we'll be right back here on most of these channels. If you're watching live on Syracuse Orange Basketball, Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, we'll be back here live after Syracuse Wake Forest. The regular season will be over. We'll see how this team played, what kind of game they played, what the day was like, anything else we know about the future at that point, and then it'll all be one and done from there. We'll know a much better picture about Syracuse's ACC tournament seeding. They could fall back to day one on Tuesday. Right now, they don't play until Wednesday. But if they lose and Boston College takes down Georgia Tech Tuesday in Greensboro, yikes. But we shall see if that's the case. So all that on the table when we return Saturday for postgame. But thank you for watching Orange Weekly. Great questions, great comments as always, friends. We do this every Thursday live about 12 noon Eastern time. But if you missed the show, you can catch it archived on all these channels. And we put up a post on syracuse.com as well. Enjoy the rest of your week, everybody. We'll talk to you again Saturday night after Syracuse takes on Wake Forest. In the meantime, this has been Orange Weekly presented by Crouse Health.